Excellence in the classroom, empowering parents, serving educators. That's the Arizona Department of Education. And this is Around the Horne, where we talk about all things education with Arizona Schools Chief Tom Horne. Well, good day and welcome to Around the Horne with Arizona State Schools Chief Tom Horne, the elected schools chief here in Arizona. And we are talking about all things education. And we have a wonderful guest today, AJ Crabill, a school board coach. Yes, there are coaches for school boards. And it sounds like the need is there. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. And I'll let Mr. Horne take over the conversation because I know that for you, Tom, that making schools better and getting those student scores up is what we're all about.
Exactly. And AJ, I first heard you at a meeting of the Council of Chiefs State School Officers, the national group, and I was very impressed with what you had to say there. And so we invited you to come to Phoenix. You were gracious enough to do it. You just addressed our executive team, and it was very, very educational for everybody. And so maybe for this podcast, you could start out with a summary of how you've gone about increasing student learning and student outcomes as measured by test scores in the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, thanks again for having me join you today. I'm super excited about the work that we're doing all across the country. The theme of the work is straightforward. Student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. But if you're going to stand on that, then you have to have a meaningful vision for how do we drive changes in adult behaviors in school systems. And a lot of the work my team and I do is to begin that shift with school boards, the folks that communities have said, these are our representatives to represent our vision and our values as a community as it relates to educating our children. And so the nature of the work is, what is it that we can do to help school boards transition from a focus on adult inputs, a focus on the buses and the budgets and the books and all of the things that go into school systems, but instead of having that be the focus, that be the measure of success, the real measure of success for school systems can only be that students actually learn at the end of the day. And so helping school boards transition from this intensive focus on adult inputs to an intensive focus on student outcomes. Did we actually see improvements in what students know and are able to do? Are the young people in our community more literate, more numerate, more able to live a choice-filled life today than they were yesterday? And what we found nationally is when school boards focus there, that they actually begin to create the conditions for improvements in student outcomes throughout their systems.
Could you reiterate what you just said? It's kind of your vision statement. You spoke it, but I really think it'd be good to reiterate the student outcomes don't.
Yeah, that student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. It's this idea that if I want to drive performance improvements for children, I want to see growth in what they know and are able to do, that our access to that begins with driving changes in my behavior as an adult, that I shouldn't be sitting around wondering, well, how come the students, we don't have the right students. We'll just wait for we have the right students in the system. Or sometimes people will go into tears like, well, when we get the right parents, then things will be better. It's like, no, that's not the answer. The answer has to be, what can I be doing differently? How can I show up in a different way that actually more thoroughly aligns with, are we accomplishing the work of educating children?
And in your experience in Texas, you actually doubled the performance of those school districts that participated in your program. Is that right?
Yeah, what we saw is that there were three different groups, the school systems who didn't go through this process, the ones who received the training, and then the ones who received the training as well as ongoing coaching for the following.
And the coaching is like monthly, is that right?
Yeah, sometimes weekly, depending on what the need looks like, but certainly a minimum monthly, where a school board coach is working with them to identify what are ways that we could make our school board meetings more focused on student outcomes. A lot of board members, like when I was a school board member, would leave board meetings and reflected, what did we actually talk about that actually is making a difference for children? We talked about important things, but we never connected that dot to, is little AJ actually more literate this week than he was last month? And so this is a way for board members to be able to, who already have this as a passion in their heart, to understand our children learning. This is a way for them to be able to systematize that first for themselves as a school board, and then through that work for their entire school system.
And you seek to have at least half of a meeting devoted to looking at the test scores of the students to see what's being achieved.
Actually, at least half of their meeting time per month.
Right.
So if they meet twice per month for 2 hours each, that's a total of 4 hours, then it's not just half of their time at one of the meetings, it's half of their time for the month. So if they met for 4 hours that month, then did you spend at least half of the time focused on what matters most? Did children learn? That's the mission. Is, are we so focused that we spend at least half of our time on the thing that we all say matters most? Did children actually learn?
And you were starting to talk about the results that you had.
Yeah.
Those who did not participate, those who had only initial training but didn't have coaching, which essentially no difference.
Yeah.
But then for people who had the monthly coaching or even more,
That's right.
you actually doubled their performance in academics. Is that right?
Well, what we saw is a doubling in the growth that they demonstrated year over year in the state accountability system, which in Texas is purely based on student outcome data around student literacy and numeracy and science and things of that nature. And so the question isn't was everybody growing? Everybody was growing. The question is, what is the rate of growth? And for the folks who got the full treatment, they received the training about how to be focused on student outcomes rather than adult inputs. And they received ongoing monthly coaching over 18-month, 24-month period and how to implement that change in adult behavior. Those folks saw twice as much growth in their state accountability as the folks who didn't do the work at all.
And even twice as much as those who got the initial training but didn't get the coaching.
That's right. And this is an important point that you surface, is that training is not enough. Like I sat down, I saw something, I felt a movement in my spirit, but then when I get home, did I actually follow through on that? It's not enough to have a really meaningful conversation, which is what a lot of training could be. There has to be a change in adult behavior over time. And for that, what we found is that coaching is necessary. Hence why my team and I, as school board coaches, are actively working to try to bring this conversation about this transition from an adult inputs focused approach to school boards to a student outcomes focused approach to school boards.
Yeah, and I think you drew the analogy of somebody who goes to church and then on Monday becomes a sinner again. And actually, we have, I've read a lot of articles about professional development is ineffective when it's a one-time class. It's only effective when it's an ongoing process.
And this is the same thing we want in our schools, certainly, is that if I really want to set my teachers up for success, then they have training that they receive, but that is aligned with ongoing coaching that they're receiving. That job-embedded real-time coaching where I'm in your classroom, I'm observing, I'm able to give real-time feedback. Maybe I'm able to actually do some modeling where I can show you what a sample instruction might look like for a given situation. And then, I do it, and we do it together, and you do it. Like that real-time job-embedded coaching, that's powerfully meaningful stuff for teachers. I would want all of our teachers to have access to that. I want our board to have access to it as well.
And I think under the Texas system that measured growth, for those who did not participate or only had initial training, you had under their system a 4, but for those who had ongoing teaching, you had an 8. So the ongoing coaching made a tremendous difference in the amount of student growth in
Absolutely.
what they were learning and what they showed in their test scores.
And what we think that difference is that 4-point growth in accountability versus that 8-point growth in accountability from the control group versus the full treatment group. We certainly think that what that represents is a shift in adult behavior in the boardroom that gives rise to shifts in adult behavior in the classroom. Or said differently, when what's happening in the boardroom actually sets teachers up to succeed, it's easier for teachers to be successful. When what's happening in the boardroom is actually a distraction, it's adding more noise into the system, it's making it harder for teachers to focus in on their work, we think that actually shows up in harm to students. And so anything that we can do to really protect the learning environment and help make it the center of attention for the school system, we think is a net benefit to students.
And you had an interesting observation, I think, about failing schools. You found teachers working very hard in failing schools.
Oh, absolutely. Like anybody who wants to throw cast aspersions at teachers and they're not working hard enough or they don't care, those folks just don't know what they're talking about. They haven't been in our schools. They haven't spent time really listening to what's on the heart of our educators. Like every educator is showing up with the best that they have to offer for the children in their care. Like this is a profession of love. People wouldn't get into the teaching profession if they didn't have an abiding love for children.
And so what's the reason that they're failing then?
Often it's just, are the things that I'm doing actually aligned with the things that our students need at the time? If I'm really fired up about dinosaurs, but right now we need children learning about the water cycle. It's not actually helpful for me to spend all my students' time teaching about dinosaurs when we really need to be teaching about the water cycle.
Mhm.
And so then what happens is later on when they take the assessment, it's not that I didn't teach, and it's not that I didn't care, and it's not that I didn't put a lot of work in. It's just that I may have been teaching something that isn't what, as a state, we said our students need to be knowing in order to be effective in their next level of learning beyond their K-12
So it's
experience.
partly that the teaching has to be in alignment with the state standards because that's what we're testing.
Certainly, it's a state, and every state's done some version of this. Said, here's what we, as a people of the state, think that our children need in order to be prepared to live choice-filled lives, so they can go out and tackle the challenges of life on their own terms, and they can ideally be able to take care of themselves and their family in a meaningful way. That each state has said, here are the things that our kids need to know in order for that to be true for them, and we want this to be true for all of our students. But that means that we actually have to teach those things.
Mm.
And when school systems are aligned in a way where that's happening, where the things that as a state we want our children to know, and the things that are being taught, and the things that teachers are being coached on and supported on, when all of those things are in alignment, then typically better things happen for kids. When all the adults are not in alignment, and the state leaders over here, the district leaders over here, and the classroom leaders over there, like that just doesn't work out to the benefit of children.
I recently read a study of studies that said studies show unanimously that the most effective way to teach is to start in the front of the room and teach from the front of the room, and then later on go around to see if students are getting it. But that in many classrooms that this particular author visited, instead of that kind of academic teaching, the students are spending a lot of time coloring with crayons. And I was shocked to see that, but that was his observation, that a lot of time is spent coloring with crayons rather than teaching the academics. And so that would be an example of teachers who may work hard, but they're not doing the right things.
So it kind of depends on the classroom. Like if this is a P4 class, then I would expect a certain amount of coloring time to be taking place. That sounds like it would be curricularly like right in alignment. If this is a high school class, maybe less so. And so trying to figure out what is the right instruction for the right grade level, for the right topic. If this is an art class, that's different than if this is perhaps an algebra class. And so trying to figure out what is the instruction that fits the grade level and the developmental level, that fits the topic level. And are we all on the same page about what that looks like and supporting the teachers in that area? That's a lot of variables to be able to juggle. And I don't think it's appropriate for school systems to expect teachers to figure all that out on their own. I think especially if school systems are making it harder for them by throwing more noise into the system. I would call for how do we get clear about what the expectations are, what does the instructional framework in our school system look like, and that the professional development that teachers are receiving be aligned with that, aligned with the standards that teachers are expected to teach, students are expected to learn. But when boards are not focused on have children actually learned, the likelihood that you are pushing that amount of alignment into the system just decreases. If you actually want that to be the case, the more the board is focused on show me evidence that little AJ is more numerate this month than he was last month, the more that there is a demand for that, the more it creates this positive pressure in the organization for alignment. And things that fall outside of that, it's just harder for them to gain purchase because the focus becomes so narrow.
You mentioned that in your presentation that most boards aren't even remotely focused on this. The percentage was single digits.
Yeah, so the challenge is that most boards aren't trained on being focused on student outcomes. This is not a willingness issue. As I visit with board members all across the state, there's this strong willingness to really be clear about our children being blessed by their time in our school system. And the challenge I find is largely a training, and that as board members receive training around what is it that's actually going to help us be more focused on student outcomes, my experience is board members have been drawn to that from every corner of the country, regardless of kind of persuasion or other issues that are coming up for them, that the call to actually focus on student outcomes is this really powerful call. But in the absence of actually receiving training on that, it's unlikely that the training that they receive is going to align with that. In fully 50% of the states across the country, there isn't even training specific to school board members in the state that's required. And every state has some amount of training that's required of all elected officials, but we're talking about How do you not break the law? How do you not violate open meetings? How do you stay out of jail? These are great for adults. And I want people to follow these laws. But if they do all those things, that doesn't mean they've actually focused on student outcomes. And fully half of the states in the union, that is the nature of the training that board members receive. And they say, okay, great, now go do great stuff for children. We have set our teachers up to fail in much the same way that we've set our school board members up to fail, that the training wasn't aligned to the task.
AJ, I think in order for superintendents to be able to report at the board meetings to the school board members how well the students are doing, what progress they're making, you have to have standards-based testing at least quarterly. As a state, we only do it once a year. So you've had the districts have standards-based testing often enough so superintendents are able to report to the board on an interim basis, not a once-a-year basis, how much progress the students are making and what they're learning.
Yeah. So one of the things that we say in our coaching work is that the frequency of monitoring gives rise to the frequency of pivoting. That how I will know whether or not I need to make a change in my adult behavior is completely bound up in have I stopped to look at the effects of my adult behavior. And so if I'm not checking on myself frequently to figure out are the things that I'm doing aligned with what I want for my students, then I wouldn't know. And so checking on that once a year, we would say is just absolutely unacceptable. That for our students who are already where they need to be, for our students who already have all the safety nets in life and they are already on grade level and all that, that's great. But for the little AJs of our communities, for whom the public education system might be the final safety net that they need to really secure and protect them, where if we don't get it right, there may not be somebody else who comes along to pick that child back up. It's those children who are disproportionately harmed when school systems don't get it right, when school boards don't get it right. And so challenging folks to say, look, we have to constantly be looking at our behavior and figuring out how to pivot because our most educationally vulnerable children are the ones who will be disproportionately harmed when we don't. Has to be a conversation that school boards are willing to have. But if school boards aren't willing to have that, my experience is it's very common that the school system won't lean into having the type of information they need to make decisions at scale. But the good news is a lot of times teachers will have this type of information. They're constantly doing formative assessment of some sort, whether that is aligned or not, that's an internal conversation for them to have. But often I run across school systems that aren't doing this interim assessment, this checks every 9 weeks, once a quarter, once a semester, that is trying to help us ascertain at the system level, are we on track? Formative data can't give you that very well because it's often not apples to apples across schools. As a system leader,
and it's not aligned to the standards.
And not aligned to the standards. As
Right.
a system leader, I really need data that shows me throughout the year how are all of my schools doing and where do I need, I see little AJ and all of his peers seem to be sliding here. I need to know that in the middle of the school year so I can make some adjustments to resource allocation. Maybe they need an additional reading coach who's pushing in and spending more time one-on-one with students who are struggling. Or maybe they need an extra instructional coach who's helping build the capacity of the teachers in that building. But if I'm not checking in the middle of the year, I can't pivot in the middle of the year in a way that's really aligned with improvements in student outcomes.
And I think you expect school boards that have been trained to do this to spend at least half of their meeting looking at the data and determining what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong, and whether people who need to be replaced with respect to student outcomes, what they show on the standards-based tests. And then the second half of the meeting, you stop listening and they can talk about political things like masks or whatever.
Yeah, my team and I are ferociously nonpartisan.
Yeah.
And that's because we think that a focus on improving student outcomes is not a partisan topic. That everywhere we go across the length and breadth of the country, people want children to learn and have a chance at life that we've received and sometimes take for granted. And so this idea of being focused on student outcomes doesn't seem to be super polarizing. Now, how you get there, what are the adult inputs? The rest of the time the board spend, often very polarizing. And that is certainly their business to pick the adult inputs that align with the values of their community. That's not our business. Our business is, are you spending at least half of the time, instead of being on that, are you spending at least half of the time on, is little AJ learning? What's working and what's not working? And what is our response to what's working and not working? And often that response is Where do we need to apply resources, or where did we think that something was working and it's not working? Where did we think something was aligned and it wasn't? And so interrogating what's working and not working isn't articulated as a punitive expression as much as it is as a growth expression. Like, if the adults aren't engaged in this continuous improvement growth process, then it's going to be hard for our students to be engaged in that as well. So that's the nature of the work. This is why you monitor half of your time every month, is to figure out what's working, what's not working, and what changes can I make as an adult to begin to give rise to improvements in student outcomes in the classroom.
You mentioned it. I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask, I think you found equal uh, resonance with your program in both conservative and liberal communities.
Whether there's hyper red, hyper blue, or super purple, we work with school boards who fit all three descriptions. And I'm thinking of some of the most conservative communities in Texas to embrace this work because they want kids to know how to read and write and do math. I'm thinking some of the most liberal communities in California, they've embraced this work.
You mentioned even
no, I don't name names. Let the guilty be the guilty. But what I will say is that even in those communities, they've embraced this work because even in the most liberal of communities, just like in the most conservative communities, that they have very different visions about how we might get there and what getting there might look like. What is common is they want all their children to succeed. And what that success looks like in different communities certainly varies.
You mentioned that there was some pushback or criticism in some communities for this strategy. Why would that be?
Well, because when everybody has this inbuilt desire to see change, and simultaneously this inbuilt fear of any change that actually requires me to change my adult behavior. Like, it's hilarious the frequency with which people, oh yeah, I heard you say student outcomes don't change until adult behavior change. Man, I tell you, when those folks over there get to changing, man, things are going to be great for our kids. It's like, I don't think you're hearing the message, my friend. It's not about those adults over there. And so what often happens is communities hear this message and boards start to respond in ways that are really uncomfortable. What it means is boards have to, at the same time that they're making radical shifts in their adult behavior, which is absolutely what we coach, is that boards make this radical acceleration away from adult inputs focus and toward a student outcomes focus. That can be really uncomfortable for a lot of folks. Some of the changes that involve, well, wait a minute, I'm used to them talking about these things that I really care about, and I don't hear them talking about those things as much anymore. They're spending all this time on these things. That can be really disconcerting. Often it's like, well, that just means you want the board not to focus on the things that matter most. It's like, actually, it's because I do want them to matter on the things that matter most. And what matters most, and we may just have a difference of opinion, but what I say matters most is, are children actually learning? And I stand on that and won't ever hesitate to back away from it.
So as we make a kind of a downslope into the end of our time here, to the average parent or person who's interested in education, which hopefully is most people, what is your call to action?
So the first thing I would say to any parent out there is the most powerful thing you can do is be involved in your child's life, whether at home, in school, in that context. But if for some reason you have some additional capacity, consider running for the school board. That school boards have to be a place where the vision and values of the community are fully represented, fully honored. And I partially ran for the school board because I had a kid who wasn't getting everything that I felt like he needed and didn't hear the answers that I felt like I needed to hear. And so I ran for the school board. And it doesn't take educational expertise. Sometimes people won't run because, well, I'm not an educational expert, I'm not a financial expert, I'm not a legal expert. You don't have to be any of those things. There's one qualification only to be effective with the school board. Are you willing to represent the vision and values of the community? And if that's you, then step forward and consider running. But there are no other requirements. You don't have to wait in line. You don't have to pass a test. All you have to do is be willing to listen to the vision and values of your community, the neighbors and parents on either side of you, and then bring that with you into your decision-making in the boardroom. And if you're willing to do that, to authentically listen for and then act on the vision and values of the community, that's all the requirements you need to be an effective board member.
Here's an example right here, 24 years in the school board. Final thoughts from the superintendent?
Well, I think what you're after people to do is to learn. School boards need to spend at least half the meeting focusing on standards-based testing that's interim, not just the end of the year, figuring out what's working and what's not working, making the changes that need to be made so that the students throughout the year, so that the students will make progress. And they need to do that for at least half the meeting, and then they can do the political arguments on the other half of the meeting.
Whatever else they want to do.
Yeah.
So how can people get a hold of your resources?
The easiest way, it's all freely available. We just want the word out there. You can go to effectiveschoolboards.com, and resources about all the things I've described are on there. We just want more families, more educators to be able to be interacting with school systems that are deeply focused on, is this child growing day by day? And where we're not, that's okay, great. Now we know that. Now let's pivot and figure out what in my adult behavior has to change to give rise to improvements and outcomes for this particular student.
And that's effectiveschoolboards.com.
That's right.
Effectiveschoolboards.com. From the great state of Texas. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Horne, of course, we've enjoyed having you around the horn. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining Arizona Schools Chief Tom Horne for Around the Horn. For more information about public education in Arizona, please go to azed.gov. And you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We'll see you next time, Around the Horn.